I thought the hardest part of marriage was balancing work and raising kids, until my wife looked me in the eye and confessed she was in love with someone else. That moment shattered my world, but what came next? That's the part one never saw coming. I had always considered our marriage steady, maybe not flawless, but solid. Chrissy and I met back in college during a campus fundraiser. She was volunteering tirelessly, radiating this unyielding optimism that caught everyone's attention. Her warmth was magnetic, and I found myself drawn to her immediately. I never imagined that the very open heart that made me fall in love with her could someday cut the other way. When we had our first child, life became a whirlwind of sleepless nights, mounting bills, and a constant juggling act of balancing work and home. Despite the chaos, Chrissy seemed unstoppable. She packed lunches, went to every PTA meeting, and still managed to work part-time as a nurse. I did my best to support her, but my demanding job at the dealership left me worn out most days, and I wasn't as present as I wanted to be. Eventually, the strain started to show. Chrissy grew more distant, slipping deeper into her caregiver role, not just for our kids but for anyone who needed her help. I admired her selflessness, but it felt like it was costing us something. Our conversations became brief, our dates rare, and the laughter that once filled our home slowly faded. Then, about 2 years ago, something shifted. Chrissy began staying late after her shifts, saying she needed extra time to help patients or finish paperwork. Initially, I didn't give it much thought, she had always been dedicated to her job. But when she started coming home looking distracted, almost lost in thought, a gnawing concern began to grow inside me. I tried bringing it up more than once, suggesting that maybe we could try counseling or even take a weekend away to reconnect. Each time, though, Chrissy would wave it off with the same response, "It's just a busy time at work, it'll calm down soon." I wanted to believe her, but deep down, something didn't sit right. Then, a week ago, things took a turn. Chrissy mentioned a coworker, a younger guy named Bruce, who had recently lost his wife. She spoke about him with a kind of tenderness that felt off. I tried brushing it off, telling myself it was just her usual empathy, but there was a lingering unease I couldn't ignore. And last night, everything came to a head. That was when the truth came crashing down, confirming the doubts that had quietly haunted me for months. I woke up with a pounding headache, dragging myself out of bed and into the bathroom, fumbling for painkillers. My stomach twisted in knots, and I hovered near the toilet, feeling nauseous from more than just physical pain. As I crouched there, waves of vivid memories from the previous day crashed over me, stealing my breath. My name is Ron Jameson, and yesterday, my entire life was turned upside down by a revelation I never saw coming. When I got home from work, Chrissy, my wife, confessed to something that shattered me. She had been involved with another man for the past year. She admitted that what started as a gesture of comfort for a grieving friend had morphed into something far deeper. She claimed she still loved me but had developed profound feelings for this man, who had recently lost his wife in a tragic accident. What stunned me most was not just the affair itself, but her plan. She intended to stay with him, not permanently, but only until she felt he no longer needed her. At the same time, she expected to continue being my wife and the mother of our children. According to Chrissy, he was younger and would eventually move on, but for now, she felt bound by duty to offer him her support. I was in complete disbelief. Shock quickly gave way to rage, and before I knew it, I lashed out, hurling words I now regret. Chrissy didn't hold back either. She fired back with accusations, saying I was the one who had failed in our marriage by not honoring my vows. She told me that if I truly loved her, I would accept the situation and give her the space she needed. Consumed by anger and heartbreak, I turned to alcohol in a desperate attempt to numb the pain. When I finally managed to calm down enough to think, I asked her a question that had been gnawing at me. "How would you feel if I found someone else?" I asked bitterly, hoping to make her see how absurd her plan sounded. I tried again, my voice quieter but no less desperate. "Are you staying here or going back to him?" She sighed in exasperation, as if I were the one being unreasonable. Ron, stop acting like a child. I've already explained everything. I love you, but I'm staying with him until he doesn't need me anymore. I fought to keep my composure. And what about the kids? I pressed. If you can't handle taking care of them, then call my parents, she answered flatly, before grabbing another bag and heading out the door. I stood there, my head pounding, my heart in pieces, trying to hold myself together for the sake of our children. But one thing was clear, I couldn't let her betrayal destroy what was left of my life. The next morning, still reeling from the previous night, I called my boss to explain the situation. I wasn't sure what I was even saying, but somehow, I got the words out. He listened patiently and then shared a story about his son's difficult divorce. It had involved false accusations and even intervention from his ex-mother-in-law, who, in a shocking twist, had threatened to testify against her own daughter to ensure fairness. That's harsh, I said, genuinely taken aback. Harsh doesn't even begin to cover it, he replied. But she saved my son's life. He told me to take all the time I needed. With plenty of personal days and vacation time saved up, I asked for a week off, which he approved without hesitation, even offering additional support if I needed it. I settled into the chair across from Tucker, exhaling deeply as I tried to steady my nerves. Yesterday, my wife told me she's been cheating on me with a younger man, I began, my voice thick with emotion. As the words left my mouth, I could feel my face flush, a mixture of anger and humiliation coursing through me. I recounted the events of the previous day as succinctly as I could manage, trying to keep my composure. Tucker sat quietly, listening intently, only occasionally jotting down notes. When I got to the part where Chrissy left our kids at her lover's house after our argument and allowed them to spend the night there, Tucker's pen paused mid-note. He glanced up briefly, gave a slight nod, then resumed writing. Once I finished, he leaned back in his chair, folding his hands in front of him. Now the big question, he said thoughtfully. What do you want to do? I stared at the floor, the weight of the question sinking in. I hadn't fully allowed myself to confront that yet. After a long pause, I looked up and met his gaze. I can't live like this, I said quietly but firmly. I don't know if I'll ever be able to forgive her. But what I do know is that I can't let her destroy me, or take my kids. Tucker nodded slowly, his expression serious. Good. That's a start. Now let's talk numbers, he said, pulling out a legal pad. What's her annual income? She makes about $25,000 a year, I replied. I'm around $80,000. He paused again, this time with a more serious look. I need you to think carefully about this next question. Do you still love her? Do you want to try and save the marriage? I lowered my gaze once more, staring hard at the floor as the question echoed in my mind. Did I still love her? Despite everything, despite the lies, the betrayal, the humiliation, the answer was complicated. After what felt like an eternity, I raised my head. My eyes stung with tears that I could no longer hold back, and when I finally spoke, my voice was barely a whisper, trembling with pain. Yes, I admitted, my voice cracking under the weight of the truth. I do love her. But I can't live with what she's done. She's humiliated me, broken our vows. I'm done. I just want a divorce. Tucker gave me a moment, allowing the silence to settle before speaking again. Okay, he said gently. Here's what we're going to do. First, I need you to handle the banking. Withdraw the money from your joint checking and savings accounts and deposit it into a new account under your name only. I can't touch the CD, I pointed out. It's in both our names, and cashing it out requires Chrissy's signature. That's fine, Tucker replied briskly, already calculating the next steps. Take $33,750 from savings, that's half. Use whatever's left in the checking account to pay as many household bills as possible. Cancel any joint credit cards, pay off their balances, and apply for a new credit card in just your name. I still have an individual card I opened before we got married, I said. Good, Tucker said with a nod. Use that for now. He stood and extended his hand, which I shook firmly, feeling a rush of gratitude for his calm professionalism. Call your father, let him know what's going on. We may need his support. As I turned to leave, Tucker added, I'll get started on drafting a petition for an emergency restraining order against your wife. If it's granted, it'll bar her from the house and keep her at least 500 feet away from you and the kids. The fact that she left your children with her lover will work in our favor. Even if the order ends up being dismissed later, it'll buy us enough time to get things sorted. The drive home was a blur, my mind spinning with everything that had happened. When I finally walked through the door, I was greeted warmly by Mary, who gave me a light kiss on the cheek. A moment later, Sam joined us, freshly washed and ready to chat. For a brief moment, I was reminded of what normalcy looked like, what a stable life felt like. It gave me the strength to push forward, knowing that no matter what lay ahead, I had to protect my kids and rebuild some semblance of the life we once had. I need to tell you something difficult, I began, my voice unsteady as I struggled to find the right words. Chrissy is having an affair, and I've decided to file for divorce. Sam's expression hardened, disbelief clouding his face. That's not true, he said sharply, his voice filled with certainty. Chrissy wouldn't do something like that. What proof do you have? She told me herself, I replied quietly, my eyes stinging as tears threatened to fall. For a moment, there was only silence between us. Sam's mind seemed to be racing, trying to grasp what I had just said. Then, with a determined look, he picked up his phone and dialed Chrissy. I could hear the tension in his breathing as he waited for her to pick up. When she finally answered, he didn't waste any time. I need to ask you something, he said, his tone steady but laced with underlying tension. Are you having an affair? There was a long, painful pause on the line. Seconds stretched like hours before Chrissy's voice cut through the silence, sharp, defensive, and trembling. What did he say? She demanded. He told me you're involved with another man, Sam answered evenly. That you've been intimate with him, and that you claim to love him. It's not what you think, Dad. Chrissy said, her voice cracking under the weight of the conversation. I'm trying to help someone. He's been through a terrible loss, and I can't just abandon him. Sam's face flushed a deep red, his jaw clenched tightly as he processed her words. His anger was palpable, but he kept his voice steady. Answer the question, Chrissy. Are you having an affair? Another long pause hung in the air, thick with tension. Sam finally turned to me, his eyes filled with regret. Without saying a word, he pulled me into a firm embrace. Ron, I'm so sorry, he said, his voice heavy with emotion. I don't know what to say. I can't believe Chrissy's done this to you. If there's anything we can do, anything at all, we're here for you and the kids. He glanced at Mary, who stood quietly nearby, her expression a mix of shock and sadness. I'll have her talk to Chrissy later, Sam added, his voice low and controlled. Right now, I can't. I'm too angry. I nodded, managing a weak thank you, before leaving to meet the locksmith at my house. Once the kids were loaded into the car, I hugged them tightly. No matter how broken I felt inside, I wouldn't let my bitterness spill over onto them. They didn't deserve that. When we arrived home, the locksmith had just finished changing the locks. I paid him, thanked him, and was about to head inside when, 10 minutes later, Chrissy's car pulled into the driveway. She stormed out, fury etched across her face. So, you ran to my parents, huh? She spat, her voice seething with anger as she marched into the house. What did you tell them? That I'm some kind of monster. Chrissy, I said, my voice low and weary. I told them the truth. And for the record, I do still love you, but I will never accept this. Sharing you with someone else. You've shattered my trust, my dignity, and everything we've built together. Her eyes flickered with something, guilt, perhaps, or maybe just hesitation, but I didn't care. I had nothing left to give her. No sympathy, no patience. I was drained. For a moment, Chrissy seemed uncertain, almost vulnerable. But then, as quickly as it had appeared, the hesitation vanished, and her expression hardened. A familiar arrogance crept back onto her face. She straightened her posture and inhaled sharply, clearly searching for her next move. "Ron," she began, her voice shifting into the patronizing tone she often used when scolding the kids, "stop acting like a fool. I'm your wife, Ron. You know me. I love you, and once this man is better, I'll come back to you," Chrissy said, her voice soft but resolute. I stared at her, feeling a mixture of disbelief and frustration tightening in my chest. "Chrissy, I can see you're determined to turn this into a nightmare," I said slowly. "Just remember, I warned you what would happen if you tried to play games with me during this divorce." She glared at me, but before she could speak, I turned toward the porch and added firmly, "I'd rather lose everything and live in poverty than stay with someone who has no moral compass." Before she could respond, the sound of tires crunching on the gravel drew our attention. A sheriff's vehicle pulled up, and a deputy stepped out, clipboard in hand. "Are you Chrissy Jameson?" he asked, his tone neutral but firm. "Yes, that's me," Chrissy replied hesitantly, her voice wavering. "Ma'am, I'm here to serve you with these documents," the deputy said, handing her the papers. Chrissy's expression shifted from uncertainty to anger. She clutched the papers tightly, trembling with frustration, and let out a strangled scream. "I didn't abandon anyone," she spat. "He's a wonderful man." "If he's so wonderful," I said coldly, "then go be with him. But don't expect any sympathy from me, or from the court." I left her standing there, fuming, and took the kids to the backyard. Kneeling down, I gently explained to them that their mom was gathering some of her things to take to her new home. I promised they would get a chance to say goodbye before she left. When that moment came, Kyle burst into tears, running into Chrissy's arms and sobbing uncontrollably. "Please don't leave, Mommy," he begged through choked cries. Meanwhile, Sally stood back, arms crossed, glaring at her mother with a defiant expression. "Apologize," I said, turning to Sally gently, hoping to ease the tension. "No," Sally said flatly, her eyes locked on Chrissy with unmistakable anger. Chrissy, visibly shaken, looked utterly broken. She fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face as she sobbed uncontrollably. I wasn't entirely surprised by Sally's reaction. She and Chrissy had been clashing a lot lately, but seeing it play out like this still left me uneasy. I worried that Chrissy's actions might leave a permanent scar on their relationship. I wrapped my arms around Sally, holding her close as she clung to me tightly. Meanwhile, Chrissy stood up, wiped her face, and without saying another word, ran to her car. Moments later, she drove off, pounding the steering wheel in frustration as Kyle cried after her, screaming, "Mommy, don't go." An hour later, Sam called. His voice was heavy with weariness as he recounted what had happened after I left. "How did it go?" I asked, hoping there had been some progress. "It was a disaster," Sam admitted. "Mary tried reasoning with her, but Chrissy wouldn't listen. She's convinced she's in the right and that the rest of us are the ones who are wrong. She even accused us of being horrible people." I sighed, already sensing where this story was headed. "That's when Mary lost her temper," Sam continued. "I've never seen her so angry. The conversation ended with Mary telling Chrissy not to call us again and warning her that if this goes to court, we won't hesitate to testify against her." The court hearing that followed was tense. Chrissy pleaded with the judge for unrestricted access to the kids, but he remained unmoved. "The children are safe where they are," he said firmly, dismissing her arguments. However, he did modify the order slightly, allowing Chrissy supervised visitation at our house. Her boyfriend, though, was strictly prohibited from coming within 500 feet of the property. The judge made it clear that if Chrissy violated this rule, she would lose her visitation rights altogether. Chrissy initially seemed pleased with the modification, but her satisfaction didn't last long. The judge added another condition, one that wiped the smugness right off her face. He ordered her to attend mandatory counseling sessions before any further changes to the custody arrangement would be considered. For the next few weeks, life was a whirlwind. I had used up all my vacation and personal days to stay home with the kids, but once my leave ran out, Sam and Mary graciously stepped in to help. They remained steadfast in their decision to cut contact with Chrissy, refusing to speak to her directly. She called 3 or 4 times a day for about a week, Sam told me one evening, his voice still tinged with frustration. Eventually, we just stopped answering. I blocked Chrissy's number, leaving any further communication to be handled strictly through our attorneys. After a few tense back and forths, the visitation schedule was finalized. Chrissy was allowed to visit the kids on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday evenings from 6 to 7 p.m. One Wednesday evening, she showed up at the house, and as usual, I went outside to meet her. She glanced around nervously before speaking. "Ron, can you tell Sally to come out? I don't want to wait here too long." "Tell him to wait down the street," Sally said defiantly from behind me, glaring in the direction of Chrissy's car. I looked Chrissy square in the eye. "Tell your boyfriend to wait somewhere else. I don't want him anywhere near this house." My tone was curt, leaving no room for negotiation. Her face flushed red with frustration, and she glared back at me. "Ron, I'm sick of the way you're treating me," she snapped. "You had no right to take money from our account or cancel my credit card." "I didn't take anything that wasn't mine," I replied coldly. "The money was used to pay off our shared credit card and cover 2 months of mortgage payments. I wasn't going to risk losing the house while you were off playing house with your boyfriend." My words hung in the air, heavy with bitterness. Chrissy opened her mouth as if to respond, but before she could say anything, Sally walked out and crossed her arms defiantly. "You're lucky Dad hasn't taken us and moved somewhere far away," she said with a glare. Chrissy's eyes widened, and for a moment, she looked completely taken aback by her daughter's hostility. Later that evening, after Chrissy had left, I received a call from Mary. "I'm sorry for the way Sally behaved earlier," she said apologetically. "She's acting like she's completely lost her mind." "Thanks for having my back," I said sincerely, grateful for her continued support. 2 weeks later, as Dwight had predicted, the restraining order was lifted. By that point, I had firmly established myself as the primary caregiver, and the court allowed me to remain in the house with the kids. Chrissy, still involved with her lover, was required to continue paying child support. Although the court granted her unsupervised visitation, I had already settled into a new rhythm with the kids, one that felt more stable and peaceful than before. One evening during a particularly tense exchange, Chrissy suddenly asked, "Do you think it would be acceptable if I decided to start a sexual relationship with another man while I was still with you?" Her question caught me off guard, but I didn't hesitate in my response. "If he was helping you recover from some tragedy, I suppose I'd be okay with it," I said dryly. "And if he said he loved you and that your sexual relationship was fulfilling, would that be acceptable too?" I added, letting the sarcasm drip from every word. Chrissy hesitated, and in that moment of silence, I saw something in her expression, uncertainty, perhaps even regret, but it didn't matter anymore. I didn't care about her answer. Her hesitation spoke volumes, but my heart had already closed itself off to any more of her games. As the divorce dragged on, I made some significant changes in my life. I was determined not to let Chrissy's betrayal define me. One particularly cutting remark she had made about my appearance stuck with me, and rather than letting it fester, I turned it into fuel for self-improvement. I researched options and decided to undergo a hair transplant. It wasn't a quick fix, but it was something I did for myself, a small step in reclaiming my confidence. At home, I also made an effort to create a healthier lifestyle for the kids and me. They weren't thrilled at first, grumbling about the absence of their favorite snacks, but I was determined to make it fun. I scoured the internet for creative, healthy recipes. Some turned out to be spectacular flops. We laughed as we tossed the disasters in the trash and made sandwiches instead. Over time, it became a family activity, with the kids eagerly pitching in to help me cook. Those moments, despite the lingering pain of Chrissy's betrayal, brought a sense of warmth and hope back into my life. Returning to work after everything that had happened was unexpectedly grounding. My co-workers, aware of my situation, offered support without being intrusive. It helped restore a sense of normalcy, something I desperately needed. Looking back, I realized that despite the storm Chrissy had caused, I was beginning to find my footing again. Life was far from perfect, but every small victory, whether it was a shared laugh with the kids or a successful meal we cooked together, reminded me that I was moving forward. I'd accept it, Chrissy said defiantly, her tone unwavering. As long as he made sure the children and I were taken care of. The tension in the room grew heavier with her words. Anne, the therapist, remained composed, methodically dismantling Chrissy's logic piece by piece. She raised valid points, calmly explaining the damage Chrissy's choices had caused and the unrealistic nature of her demands. But no matter how reasonable Anne's arguments were, Chrissy refused to back down. It didn't take long for me to realize that these sessions weren't helping. They had become nothing more than a stage for Chrissy to double down on her justifications. She wasn't looking to repair what had been broken, she was looking to defend her actions at all costs. As time passed, the sting of Chrissy's betrayal began to dull, not because I had forgiven her, but because I was finally starting to let go. I came to an important realization about love: it isn't something that survives on its own. It needs attention, care, and mutual respect to thrive. Without those things, even the deepest love can wither and die. I shifted my focus. Instead of dwelling on what I had lost, I poured my energy into the things that mattered most: my kids, my own personal growth, and a new dream that had been quietly taking shape in the back of my mind. For as long as I could remember, I had loved fixing cars. There was something about bringing old, beat-up vehicles back to life that gave me a sense of purpose. I'd been passionate about restoring cars since I was 14, and over the years, I had honed my skills to the point where I could handle almost any repair. But working at the dealership was beginning to wear me down. The endless quotas, tight deadlines, and constant pressure were draining me of the joy I once felt. That's when I started thinking about opening my own shop, something small, something I could control, where I could focus on my passion and have more time with my kids. I discussed the idea with Sam, who immediately offered his full support. He even suggested I use his converted barn, which he had been using as a workshop, to get started. The space was perfect, and with Sam's encouragement, I began to see the possibility of making it a reality. There was just one problem: I still had commitments at the dealership. I braced myself for the fallout when I decided to tell my boss, Bob. Approaching his office, I took a deep breath and knocked on the door. "Got a minute, Bob?" I asked, stepping inside. "Sure, Ron," he said, motioning me to sit down. "Glad you're here. We've got a busy weekend ahead, 44 cars arriving on Friday, and they all need to be prepped and ready to move by the end of the month." A pang of guilt hit me, but I knew I had to press on. "That's why I'm here, Bob," I said, steadying my voice. "I can't work this weekend. I've started my own side business, and I need to honor my commitments to my clients." Bob leaned back in his chair, his brow furrowed as he considered my words. "I get that you want to branch out, Ron, but I need you here this weekend. Maybe you can convince your customers to wait a few days." I shook my head. "I can't do that. I've made promises, and I need to follow through." Bob was quiet for a moment, then surprised me by saying, "If your shop passes inspection, I'll hire you as a contractor to handle our bodywork. That way, you can run your business and still help us out when we need you." I was stunned. This was more than I had hoped for, and I quickly agreed. That weekend, I worked at the dealership, but I also continued to grow my own shop. Within a few weeks, I was running my shop full-time, and occasionally, I would step in to assist the dealership when they needed an extra hand. Sam joined me part-time, helping with repairs, while Mary took over the bookkeeping. The business quickly became a family effort, and those moments spent working together brought us closer in ways I hadn't expected. Despite the lingering pain of Chrissy's betrayal, I began to feel a renewed sense of purpose. I was building something not just for myself, but for my kids, a life where I could be present for them, where we could laugh, work, and grow together. During our 5th counseling session, it became clear that nothing was going to change with Chrissy. She remained as defiant as ever, clinging to her version of reality, unwilling to take responsibility for the damage she had caused. But by that point, it didn't matter to me anymore. I had already started moving forward, rebuilding a life that didn't depend on her. I decided to focus on the most pressing parts of the post-divorce questionnaire. The questions ranged from mundane topics like family traditions to deeply personal ones. What was your relationship with your parents like? And how was your intimacy with your partner? Most of it was straightforward, until I reached one question that made me stop cold. If you could change one thing about yourself or your relationship, what would it be? That evening, I sat there staring at the question, pen poised but unmoving. I couldn't answer it right away, it felt too heavy, too loaded. I set the questionnaire aside, knowing I needed time to think it through. The next day, after much reflection, I finally wrote my answer. If I could change one thing, I wish I had been a better husband, so my wife wouldn't have fallen out of love with me. As I finished writing, I felt a knot form in my chest. The admission, as simple as it was, carried a weight I hadn't fully acknowledged until that moment. Deep down, I knew that while Chrissy's actions had hurt me deeply, I wasn't without fault. I hadn't always been the best partner, and now I was left wondering if things could have turned out differently had I been more attentive, more present. A few days later, I found myself sitting across from Chrissy once again, this time negotiating the final terms of our settlement. She looked tired, more vulnerable than I'd seen her in a long time. The sight hit me harder than I expected, but I fought the instinct to offer comfort. I knew it wouldn't change anything. I know your lawyer hasn't been happy with my proposed settlement, I said, steering the conversation back to business. So, I've instructed my attorney to offer some alternatives. I'm willing to expand your visitation time with the kids, and I'm also offering $1,000 a month in alimony for 3 years. All I want is to be done with this and move on. Chrissy looked stunned. She opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. After a long pause, she simply nodded, unable to argue further. Our next counseling session took a different approach. And suggested that Chrissy attend the session alone, followed by a solo session with me. I agreed, albeit with a sigh. Months ago, when Chrissy had first dropped the bombshell about her affair, I had been consumed by rage and bitterness. But now, I just felt drained. This whole situation wasn't just tearing me apart, it was hurting Chrissy, her parents, and, worst of all, our children. All I wanted was for the pain to stop. By the time I sat down for my final solo session with Anne, a sense of relief washed over me. I was glad Chrissy wasn't there, and even more grateful that we were nearing the end of this emotionally exhausting process. And began by reviewing the questionnaire responses I had submitted earlier. You wrote that you wished you'd been a better husband so Chrissy wouldn't have stopped loving you, and said gently, her tone measured but empathetic. She paused, letting the weight of my own words settle over me. Then, she added, when Chrissy read that, she completely broke down. It was the most emotional I've ever seen her, and it took a long time to calm her down. I didn't know how to respond. I sat in silence, processing what Anne had just said. Anne leaned forward slightly, her voice softening. Ron, your wife never stopped loving you. She made terrible choices, choices that hurt you and the kids, but she didn't stop loving you. I remained quiet, unsure of how to feel. Even if Chrissy hadn't stopped loving me, it didn't change what had happened. The damage was done. But Anne's words stirred something within me, an ache I hadn't felt in a long time. I'm telling you this because it matters, Anne continued. But more importantly, I want you to focus on what comes next. Your kids need you, Ron, and they need to rebuild their relationship with their mother. Sally's grades have dropped significantly. Kyle has become withdrawn, and even little Ronnie, who seemed to be the most stable, avoids any mention of Chrissy altogether. Before wrapping up, Anne handed me a folded piece of paper. This is Chrissy's response to the same question you answered earlier. I thought you should see it. I unfolded the paper slowly, my eyes scanning the words Chrissy had written. If I could change one thing, it would be that I never met Bruce Hartman. For a moment, I sat there stunned, unsure of how to react. Part of me felt vindicated, like maybe she finally understood the magnitude of her actions. But another part of me just felt tired. The divorce was finalized not long after that session. Chrissy was granted shared custody, with continued child support payments on her part. While the legal process was over, the emotional healing was far from complete. Over time, life began to stabilize. Sam and Mary's support remained steadfast, and slowly, the kids adjusted to our new reality. A woman named Rebecca, who I met through mutual friends, eventually became a part of our lives. The kids adored her, and she brought a warmth into our home that had been missing for so long. Chrissy never completely accepted that I had moved on, but as I had once told her during one of our last conversations, the discussion was over. She had two choices: accept it or don't.